Today we'll be looking at the aggregate demand model, also known as simply AD for aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total quantity of goods and services that all buyers in an economy want to buy at different possible price levels, ceteris paribus. In other words, other things remaining the same or equal. I've put an asterisk next to this. You need to know this definition. It pops up many times in essays, and it could pop up in a data analysis. The aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the total quantity of goods and services buyers want to buy, and it doesn't matter if these buyers are within your country or other countries, but they want to buy your domestically produced goods, also known as real GDP demanded, and the economy's price level, ceteris paribus. It's very similar to micro. It's downward sloping. You can refer to it simply as AD. You don't have to write out aggregate demand. But in macro, I want to point out an absolute key difference in how you label the axes. In micro, we said price, but in macro, we say price level. That's very important. And in micro, we say quantity, but here we're saying real GDP or output. Either is fine. You can either refer to it as real GDP or you can write output, but do not use micro labeling. You'll get docked marks for that. Components of AD. It's made up of 4 different components. It's not just the demand of consumers. So in your definition, do not put the term consumers. That's only one component. It consists of all the components of aggregate expenditure, so whoever can be spending money acquiring things. So we have the demand of consumers, known as C for consumers, the demand of businesses or firms, which we refer to as I, which we'll follow up on in a minute, but I standing for investment, which is when firms buy capital, and capital is what they need to make other goods and services. The demand of government, which we refer to as G, and then the demand of foreigners for exports. So we take exports minus the demand for imports, and we refer to that as X minus M, or net exports. So in investment, just following up on this, investment is defined as the addition of capital stock to the economy. Now, capital is a very specific term. It's not referred to as, it's not the same thing as savings. Capital stock is what we need to produce goods and services. They are man-made. And there's 2 types of investment. Replacement investment, when firms are spending on capital to maintain the productivity of their existing capital. So in other words, they're replacing machines due to wear and tear, which is also known as depreciation. Or it could be induced investment, when firms are now going to buy more capital so that they can increase their output because they're responding to higher demands of the economy. So in other words, the national income's gone up. Buyers want more products, and so the firms are induced to invest. They've got the reason to invest in buying more capital to fulfill that demand. Government spending. If we think of what types of governments there are, there's of course municipal, there's provincial, thinking of it in Canada, and there's federal. And if we think of what types of things the government spends money on, they're numerous. It could be healthcare, could be education, known of course as merit goods, could be military, could be infrastructure, etc. And net exports being exports minus imports. So if we think of aggregate demand as being all of these components added together, so this is consumption, government spending, investment, which is when firms buy capital, and net exports. So why do we subtract imports from aggregate demand? Well, if we were trying to track this, we were, let's say, Statistics Canada, Stats Canada, and you were getting data on what did consumers buy, what did the government spend money on, what did firms buy money on. It would be a complete nightmare to be tracking that information and each time saying, okay, well, what did you spend money on that's strictly domestic goods? So everyone would have to separate out all of their receipts. They'd have to look for labels to see what had been imported. It would just not be feasible. So instead, we add all of these things together, knowing that some of them will be made up of imports. Then we add the exports, because that's what the rest of the world is demanding of our goods. And we back out the imports because they're easy to track. As they cross the Canadian border, we've got import receipts and duty being paid and all sorts of a paper trail. So we subtract imports at the end, so we're backing them out of what consumers have bought in the government and what firms have invested in. So the definition of AD once again, so aggregate demand is the total amount of real output or real GDP that we have consumers, firms, the government, and foreigners demand or want to buy at each possible price level over a particular period of time, ceteris paribus. Now we're going to look at changes in aggregate demand. So what's going to make the AD curve shift? And you're going to see that we're going to go fairly quickly over these macro concepts because we're really building on what we've seen in micro. You're going to see a lot of similarities, but now we're looking at shifting the overall demand for products and goods in an economy, and you'll see that they're very similar. So changes in consumer spending. Consumers will spend more or less if there's changes in wealth. Same thing about changes in expectation about future income. If they think that things will get rosier, they'll start to spend now. If consumers think that there's gloom and doom ahead, they'll probably stop spending and start saving more. And the same thing tied into that, the expectations about the future of the economy, because their jobs ultimately will be tied in with that. Changes in interest rates, changes in personal income taxes, changes in the level of household indebtedness. This is a real issue, particularly in North America, Canada, and the States right now. With households becoming more and more indebted, they have less money to buy on new goods and services because they're servicing their debt. They're having to pay back the debt plus interest rates. And changes in attitude towards spending. When income increases, consumption increases by a smaller amount. Now, why would that be? Well, if your income increases, yes, you may consume some, but you might also spend money on taxes, savings, and imports. And we will be looking at this further when we look at the money multiplier, but not everything not all the income that a consumer receives as an increase will be spent on domestic goods and services. Now, does this have the same effect on a developing country as a developed country? Why or why not? Well, I would argue in a developing country for poor people who are struggling to get ahead, that they're going to have much less in savings that they're putting their money towards. They probably are putting more of any increase in income into things like food, necessities, housing, clothing, and so on. Changes in investment spending as a result of the following. So just a reminder that investment is spending by firms on capital, which are man-made items and machines and tools, things that you need to produce more goods and services. So businesses will react to changes in expectation of future sales, changes or improvements in technology, changes in interest rates, business taxes, and legal or institutional changes, such as instituting property rights. So as an example, if you are in a, let's say, developing country, and they have recently instituted property rights, there'll be more investment by firms because they'll feel more secure in the future of their business, and they know that it won't be taken away from them, or at least not quite so easily. Okay, so what are two reasons why an increase in interest rates might cause business to invest less? Well, we've got one. So increase in interest rates, loans become more expensive. you have to pay more in interest. And so you have less money to invest. And the second reason is if the interest rates are particularly high, so if interest rates are high, there's more of an incentive for businesses to park their money in a bank and have their money increase relatively safely without as much risk than by trying to expand their business, which usually is really quite risky. And yes, they may get higher profits, but on the other hand, they also might be facing losses. So if interest rates are high, there's more incentive to earn money by putting funds in bank accounts rather than by expanding the business. Changes in government spending. They can be because of political priorities. So we can see, particularly when a new government is voted in, they may be radically different than the other government. They may be more in favor of higher education and training. They might believe more in investing in infrastructure or less in these things. So political priorities definitely play a role. And the more left you are to the spectrum, the more you are in favor of government spending, and the more you are to the right of the political spectrum, the more you are sort of hands-off and let the economy perform on its own. And also, we're going to see later on that the government often interferes, or want to use the term interferes, that maybe has negative connotations, but manipulates and tries to influence aggregate demand for various reasons, and we'll be spending quite a bit of time on that. Changes in export spending minus import spending. Well, if we have changes in real national income abroad, so let's say if the rest of the world becomes more expensive, we buy more of our exports, and changes in exchange rates. If our currency appreciates and worth more, it becomes more expensive for other countries to buy our goods, and our exports go down. Or if our currency depreciates, our goods now become cheaper for other countries, and they buy more of our exports. So testers, let's look at the impact of the following situations on aggregate demand. Let's explain what happens to aggregate demand in each case and identify the component of aggregate expenditure involved. Okay, we have consumers becoming optimistic about future conditions in the economy. The level of employment, the level of income, expected economic growth, so they're feeling confident. It makes sense that they would then start to spend more. So AD is going to shift to the right. We'll show it with two arrows. We'll call it AD2. And the component is C for consumer spending. The government decides to increase taxes on firms' profits. Well, if firms have less money now, because they're giving the government more money, they'll have less money to invest. So the AD curve will shift to the left. Show it with two arrows, AD2, and the component is I for investment. Firms become fearful that a recession is about to begin. Again, if firms have lost confidence in the economy, they'll expand less. AD shifts left. And again, the component is I. The government decides to increase its spending on healthcare services. So that's part of government spending, a component of AD. And the component, of course, is G. A central bank, a government organization, we'll look into this in a future lesson, decides to increase interest rates. Well, with increased interest rates, it's going to make it more expensive for consumers to buy particularly big ticket items like fridges, appliances, cars, houses, and so on. And it will make it more expensive for businesses to borrow money, and so they will reduce their investment. So AD will shift to the left, and we have two components happening here. We have C plus I. Real incomes in countries that purchase a large share of countries A's exports fall. So we're going to assume that other countries that buy our goods, they are now earning less. Their GDP's gone down. Their incomes of individuals have gone down. So they're going to buy fewer of our exports. Exports are a component of AD. So AD shifts to the left. And the component that went down is exports. So again, as long as we are tracking our domestically produced goods and services, it doesn't matter whether it's our own citizens buying the goods or foreign countries. The government lowers personal income taxes, so taxes on the income of households. So now households have more money. Consumers are going to spend more. AD shifts to the right. AD2, and the component is consumers. There's a decline in the real estate market, so the average house prices fall. So what happens now is that people are less wealthy. So whether you own your house outright or whether you have a mortgage, the asset that you own is now worth less than it was before, and so you have a sense of being less wealthy than you were before. People will tend to then spend less because they have less wealth. And the component is new legislation makes property rights more secure. I'm thinking of this one in the context of firms. If firms know that their firms can't be seized, nationalized, taken over by someone else, they'll feel more secure to expand, and they will take on more investment. So AD will shift to the right. The component is I for investment. There's an appreciation, an increase in the value of the euro relative to the US dollar. So we're looking at the impact on aggregate demand in Eurozone countries, so countries that have adopted the euro. So we have an increase in the value of the euro, so it means that other countries are going to buy fewer of our goods because it has now become more expensive. Exports are a component of AD, and so AD once again has shifted to the left. And the component is exports. There's an appreciation or an increase in the value of the euro relative to the US dollar. So now let's look at the impact on aggregate demand in the United States. Okay, so if the euro has appreciated, that means that people will be able to buy more of the United States exports. Now, we'll look at this in international trade, but if the euro has appreciated, it also means that the US dollar has depreciated relative to the euro. So it does become cheaper for the Europeans to buy US exports. So in this case, AD shifts to the right, and this is AD for the United States. And don't get too worried about understanding the repercussions of a depreciating and appreciating currency. We'll be looking at that more in international trade. So a non-government organization, an NGO, introduces a program that provides credit to small farmers. So it's easier for small farmers to borrow in order to finance building of things like irrigation projects and the purchase of new farm equipment. So if they're buying more, again, capital, because they've got the funds to do so, the AD curve will shift to the right. And the component is investment. Okay, this is only going to be a very brief introduction to fiscal and monetary policy. We'll be looking at this in future lessons covering just this material, but it ties in fabulously with aggregate demand because these are known as demand-side policies. So in other words, policies set out to influence aggregate demand. So governments, we've got two broad categories of policies that can affect aggregate demand. They're known as fiscal policy and monetary policy. You need to know these very well and realize what the difference between the two is. Fiscal policies. If you think of everything to do with a budget for a government, a budget contains government policies about how and where and how much they're going to spend their money on different programs. And it also includes how much they're going to tax individuals and corporations. And governments use expansionary fiscal policy to increase aggregate demand, and contractionary or deflationary fiscal policy to reduce aggregate demand. And again, not to worry, we'll look at this in depth. So expansionary fiscal policy. If we were to lower personal income taxes, we know that consumption would go up. If we were to lower, and so AD shifts right. If we were to lower corporate taxes, we know that investment would increase, and again, AD would shift right. And if we were to increase government spending, we know that G would increase, and again, AD would shift right. So again, these are fiscal, to do with taxation, whether it's personal or corporate, or government spending. These are things that we would expect to see in a budget. Monetary policy. It's a set of official policies governing the supply of money and interest rates. And we'll see later on that the supply of money and interest rates are related. Now we're going to look at monetary policy, which, as a reminder, is changing the supply of money and interest rates. So what would be the effect on aggregate demand of lowering interest rates? Well, we know that it would be cheaper now for consumers to borrow. And also, consumers have less incentive to put money in the bank to save because they're getting a lower rate of interest. And so they're getting less money for parking their money there. So again, they have more incentive to spend it rather than save it. And we also now know it's cheaper for businesses to borrow money, so they're going to invest more in capital and expand. So when this happens, when AD is lowered, their supply of money is increased, it's referred to, and you might hear this in the news, as a loose monetary policy. To operate a contractionary or tight monetary policy to reduce AD, the central bank would increase the base rate or their interest rate. So what is a central bank? You can't walk into a central bank and set up your own bank account. Ours is on Sparks Street in Ottawa, and it is considered an institution that will loan to the other commercial banks, and it also sets the interest rates, the official Canadian interest rates, which then influences what the rate will be charged by, like the Royal Bank and CIBC and RBC and so on. So in most industrialized countries, we've got the central bank being independent from the federal government, and its primary responsibility is to maintain a low and stable rate of inflation in the economy. So if you were to look up Bank of England, Bank of Canada, the Federal Reserve in the States, generally in the upper right-hand corner of their website, you will see a target inflation rate. And for Canada, it's generally between 2 and 3%. So the central bank will step in and try to influence AD to keep the inflation rate around that 2 to 3%. And we will look at in future lessons what is the relationship between influencing AD and influencing the price level or inflation. So even though the central bank in many countries is independent, we often consider it as part of the government monetary policy. So in an IB question, If you were to talk about government policy being fiscal and monetary, and the monetary being interest rates and the supply of money, you won't be penalized. You don't have to specify that it is a separate entity. And in class, we're going to look at the Bank of Canada. We'll take a look at their policy of inflation. But just for some fun, we're going to look at unclaimed balances. So if you have missed our class, you might want to log on to this website, try to find the tab that takes you to the unclaimed balances. And under Ontario, just for the fun of it, if you look up, oh my goodness, the comedian Russell Peter Russell, I've forgotten, but you'll know who I'm talking about. And you'll see that he has an unclaimed balance. And what other students often like to do is then to search on their family and relatives' names to see if they have an unclaimed balance. I did find an unclaimed balance for my brother-in-law a few years back of several $100s, so it can be a bit of fun. And that is it.